We wanted to start off by just quickly reviewing the exercise. So we're just going to load sdmTMB. The first thing here was just to try simulating some random fields to get a feeling for what the range and the spatial standard deviation do. So if we run this with sdmTMB simulate, each time I run this, we get a different draw of a random field with a range of 0.6 and the x and the y, that's in the units of the x and the y data. The x and the y data go from 0 to 1. So that's saying at about 0.6 units, the data points are effectively independent. Each time I run this, I get a different draw. If I were to change the range to something really small, say 0.1, and I run this again, I can see that the spatial correlation decays much more quickly now. So I get a much more wiggly pattern. If I were to make this range big, say 1, then at this point the range is basically the whole distance from the left to the right or the top to the bottom. So the spatial correlation decays really slowly. If I were to put this back to 0.6 and run this again, now if I were to increase the spatial standard deviation to something much bigger, like 2, if we look over here on the right now, the random field deviations are going from about positive 0.3 to negative 0.3 roughly. And if I make that much bigger, then the scale of the deviations just gets much bigger. So the sigma O, the spatial standard deviation, is controlling the magnitude of the wiggliness, and the range is controlling the rate at which the spatial correlation decays, the distance at which it decays to be effectively independent. After that, we just had an example with the Pacific Cod dataset that we used in a number of the slides. And we just plotted out the raw data, plotted it out by year, constructed a mesh with make mesh, and plotted it. Started by fitting just a simple spatial model with a smoother for depth. I'll run this one because it runs relatively quickly. And we can look at the output with looking at fit 1. You can check to make sure the gradients are small so that there's evidence that is converged. We have standard errors for everything. We can use tidy to look at the coefficients. And then we have an example here of plotting across a range of depths to look at the effect. And there's an experimental function right now that just does this for you, called plot smooth for simple smoothers. Looks similar to what you would get out of MGCV. Then we predict across full survey grid. First, we're looking here at the predictions from the covariates. Everything is not a random field. So that's the depth effect plotted in space. The omega s, these are the spatial random fields. So these are the latent variables that are not in the model that are causing spatial correlation. We can look at the full estimate in link space, so in log space, or here exponentiate it to get our predictions in terms of actual density of fish. Then we had another one that fits the same kind of model but extends it to include time. So we add a year and we tell it that we want the spatiotemporal fields to be independent. I've already fit that one. We get output, looks similar, but now we also have a spatiotemporal standard deviation. The range parameter right now is shared between these two fields. We've added a factor effect for each year, so those are shown up here. I won't go through all of the predictions, but it's the same as last time, other than now we also have these fields for the, maybe I will. First part of the same. But now if we look at our spatial standard deviation or spatial random fields, they're the same for every single year. Those are constant latent effects. And if we look at our spatiotemporal effects, the epsilon STs, these vary from year to year. So the spatial one might be representing any constant spatial factors, depth if that wasn't in the model. But the spatiotemporal fields are representing everything else that's changing from year to year. So it could be bottom temperature, it could be salinity or oxygen or predator and prey species. And then there was a third example here that extended a bit beyond what we did in the slides, and that was to change the share range argument to be false. And if share range is false, I've already fit this because it takes maybe about 30 seconds to fit. Difference is that now we get a separate range estimate for the spatial and the spatiotemporal field. And in this case, the range estimate is considerably larger for the spatial field than for the spatiotemporal field. And then at the bottom, we use those predictions to calculate a population index, which is the same thing that we did in the slides. So with that, did anyone have any questions about the exercises?
Jim Iannelli in the chat is asking if the spatial field changes much when you leave out each year. Jim, were you thinking about dropping years of data? Is that what the question is?
Yeah, kind of like a leave one out. I'm curious if you've had that experience where the field, the constant part will vary much depending on how many years of data are included. I mean, yeah, the sensitivity to each year, I guess.
Probably pretty situation specific. I would say the more interannual variability there is and how much of that is captured in the years you're dropping out, the spatial field would change quite a bit.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't really have much experience looking at that, but it probably is situation specific. Is there anything else? I can't see any of the chat or anything, Lewis. Otherwise, we can move on to the first set of slides.
All right, I think that's me, correct?
One quick question here from Chantel. In the last model here, how should we interpret the maximum likelihood criterion? That convergence, I think she's talking about what's printed in the console.
This should be the negative log likelihood. Yep. Sharing the range more of a speed argument. There are good science reasons to share the range between the spatial and spatiotemporal fields. It's a bit of both. I think in VAST, I think the range is always shared, is my understanding. I think the thinking is that there's not a lot of information in the data often to inform the range, and so it really is helpful with model convergence to share that range between the two. So yeah, it certainly helps with speed and convergence. I don't think there's probably a good biological reason to share that range. I mean, I think ideally you let everything vary, so it's more of a computational issue.
I haven't thought too much about it, but I guess you could maybe make the case that by sharing the range, you're constraining it a bit more, because if it was totally independent, the spatiotemporal fields could have a much smaller range, then you might be more prone to overfitting.
Yeah, certainly. And the reality is they should be somewhat related, but not exactly the same. And I think that's also where some of the priors and the penalized complexity, or PC priors, that are on a set of slides that we may or may not get to today can come in to help constrain the range and the spatial and spatiotemporal standard deviation to something reasonable. Okay, did you want to go ahead, Eric?
Yeah. All right. I will join. I think we've got about 5 or 6 kind of short, condensed topics to talk about today, with breaks as we did last week. The first of these is going to be talking about detailed modeling of presence-only data. This was a request that came up at the end of last week, and so I think the kind of data that we have with presence-only data are similar to the tree data set that I talked about last week, where we have, in this case, this is the presence of 3,000 some odd trees on Barrow, Colorado Island, and these are the locations of those individual trees. We don't have locations of the zeros, though, so the problem becomes that if we try to fit this model using something like logistic regression, the models just won't converge because all you have is ones. The strategy that I talked about last week in our third module was thinking about basically rasterizing this data onto a grid, and then we could get the number of trees in each grid cell and treat that as the response. And you can feed that kind of data easily into sdmTMB or similar software, GAMs and things like that. This is a slightly different approach in that we're actually going to try to model these locations of these trees individually rather than doing the aggregation. And so there's a number of different ways to generate these zeros. These are they're called false zeros, pseudo absences, or quadrature points in the literature. They all mean the same thing, and they're just going to be generated via simulation. The strategy here can be to generate them on a equally spaced grid, or generate them randomly, or with respect to the actual density of the observations. And so one of the general recommendations is that if you're especially interested in thinking about effects of covariates, et cetera, these kinds of points should be somewhat proportional to areas of high environmental variability, where you actually need more data to pull out kind of the signal from the noise. There's also a large question about, if we're generating all of these pseudo absences with simulation, how many zeros do we want to actually generate? And so we want it to be obviously large enough so that our predictive performance of these kinds of models doesn't change as we add more zeros. You can think about the predictive performance of the model essentially reaching some asymptote, and we want to get to a place where that asymptote is kind of reached, or the marginal gains in performance are small. Okay, so to generate this, in sdmTMB, I'm just going to take a very simple approach where we're going to essentially use that tree data as our observations, and I want to generate pseudo absences for that data. I'm going to pretend that it's basically on a rectangular grid, and so I'm not going to actually run code here. All the code for doing this is actually on the slides, and so if you're interested in running it yourself, it's probably best to start with those the markdown files for the slides. But here, all we're doing is essentially generating a grid of essentially 5-kilometer grid cells that are equally spaced throughout the region or the survey domain of the tree data. And so by doing this creates a grid with 20,000 points. Okay, the next step is obviously going to be to take our, we've created these fake zeros, and so we're going to, any of the observations where we actually have data, we'll create a new variable, and say that the presence is 1. In the zeros, it's going to be 0. We can bind them together, and then we can make a mesh based on that combined data. In this case, remember, when we use the make mesh function, we specify our cutoff distance, which is essentially the minimum distance between 2 locations. And this creates a mesh of about 600 or 675 vertices. So this is what our mesh looks like now for the tree data set. We have the red grid dots here are the locations of each of these pseudo absences that I've generated using the expand.grid function. The gray triangles are the mesh, and remember where they intersect are the vertices or the knots for the mesh. The blue dots are the locations of our raw data. You have to kind of squint to see those, but you can see that they're they are exactly what I showed on the first slide. Okay, so I'm going to present 2 kind of approaches that people have used to deal with this kinds of data. The first is called infinitely weighted logistic regression. And in this case, what we're going to do is create this new weight variable. And the weight variable is going to take on, one of two values. So it's going to be 1 for our presences, and it's going to be 0, or it's going to be a very large number. This NW, sorry about this slide issues. It's going to be a very large number for those absences, and so those weights, which are in this WT variable I've created, can be passed into any modeling framework in R, GLMMs and GAMs and GLMMs, etc. It's important to know that in creating these weights, we can create these weights with this data, pass it into GLM, but those models don't actually deal with the spatial process that we're actually trying to also account for. Okay, so in terms of passing these into SDMTMB, I've created this dummy variable that's present, basically whether the data correspond to an actual observation or whether the data correspond to one of my pseudo absences. And I've specified the family is binomial because we're just going to do logistic regression, and the weights argument is just this WT that I've added to our data frame. Notice the weights here. The weights argument doesn't come as a character string or a name of a variable in the data frame. It has to be a vector of that's the same length as the observations that you're passing in, or the number of rows in all dat here. Okay, so the potential downside of this infinitely weighted logistic regression is that the number, or like your convergence, or how well the model is able to estimate these parameters is affected by the size of your pseudo absences, and so that's something that that's potentially problematic. The other thing is, if I go back a slide, the results, if you care about the intercept that you're going to be estimating here, the intercept is sensitive to the choice of whatever this very large number is here. So that's another downside. So it's sensitive to the choice of, so your parameter estimates are sensitive to NW, and the convergence of the model is sensitive to how many pseudo absences we've actually generated. Okay, so we can look at the model fit here, and based on all of the convergence diagnostics that Sean's talked about in week 1, things look like they converge pretty well with these 20,000 pseudo absences. So that's a good sign. So the downsides, as I talked about with the infinite weighted logistic regression, are that are those 2 sensitivities. The second approach that I want to talk about is called down-weighted Poisson regression, and it's similar to the last approach in that we're going to be generating some weights for these pseudo absences, but it doesn't have the same downfalls in terms of these arbitrary effects on our intercept or the likelihood. So in this case, we're doing something similar where we're going to create our weighting variable is just in this last block of code here, and essentially it's going to be 1 if the data correspond to one of our true observations or locations. And otherwise, we're going to set it to be equal to the actual, basically the area that corresponds to each of the pseudo absences. And so you can think about, if we're taking our domain of our tree data and dividing it into these 20,000 locations, each of these cells is going to be 1/20,000th of that total area. Okay, so just as before, we're going to be passing it in with a weights variable. The differences between down-weighted Poisson regression and the previous approach I showed was that now we're going to be modeling the Poisson mean or that spatial intensity as a Poisson distribution with a log link rather than the binomial logistic regression. Okay, so as before, everything converges just fine. And then we can start pulling out the output and comparing it to what we showed last week. And so I think the first thing is obviously we can pull out our spatial field as the omega s from our predict function. We can look at what those predictions look like in either link, or in this case, this is because we're using Poisson regression, this is log space. Or what these predictions look like when we convert that intensity parameter back to normal space. So these are interpreted now as the probability of probability, or the average intensity or probability of a tree being there. So with these kinds of models where we're generating pseudo absences, we want to think about, well, how well does the model fit? And so one of the ways we can do that are to use statistics like AUC for thinking about predictive accuracy. And so what AUC is, I think most people are probably familiar with it. We're essentially trying to balance our true positive rate and the false positive rate, and approximating the integral of that curve between those two values. So the AUC statistic can be between 0 and 1. Values close to 1 represent a really good measure of the ability to separate out those zeros and ones. And so in this case, our statistic with this 20,000 pseudo absence data set is 0.815, which is pretty good. So I wanted to do a simple sensitivity. Is 20,000 points pseudo absences enough? We can bump that up from 20,000 to 30,000 points, and we see very little change in our AUC statistic. It goes from 0.815 to 0.816, so basically the same. Similarly, we can take it from 20,000 and crank it down to 5,000 pseudo absences. Again, we get very similar AUC statistics. So at least what this says is that even our 20,000 is probably overkill for a mesh of this complexity or data set of this size. Okay, so the other thing we can explore sensitivity to is with respect to the resolution of the mesh. And so remember, we talked about last week, the more vertices or knots that we add to our mesh, it's going to be increasing in resolution. And so we're going to get a more fine or more smooth spatial surface that's going to give us a better approximation to our data. And so when we change our cutoff now from what used to be 25 to 15, the number of knots in our mesh changes from 700 to 1750. What we see is our AUC really changes from 0.815-ish to 0.845. So we get a marginal gain in using that higher resolution mesh, which corresponds to better, overall better separation of those zeros and ones. So that's kind of the end of the second approach, the down-weighted Poisson regression. And I think the take home of these methods is that if we're going to be using these pseudo absences, our parameter estimates that we're going to be generating from sdmTMB, if you care about things like your spatial range or the spatial variance parameters, these aren't sensitive to the choice of your raster grid cell size or the resolution of that lattice. And so that's a benefit. These don't take very long to fit at all. So I think that there's no real computational burden either. And then last, I think it's useful to probably think about, last week I showed how these estimates look like when we do the rasterization and fit data on the lattice. And that's what we see on the bottom panel here. So we're modeling the number of trees in each grid cell as being a negative binomial response. And so that's the bottom plot. The top plot here represents that downweighted Poisson regression applied to the data set with 20,000 pseudo absences. So we can see, comparing the two, when we had binned everything onto the lattice, as expected, things are a bit more coarse, a bit more chunky maybe. And so I think we get a much more smooth surface and a lot more variability and maybe nuance when we use the pseudo absences. So that is kind of the end of the material for this this section, and it's probably worth taking a few questions if there are any. Lewis, I saw a couple come up in the chat.
Yeah, got pretty lively chat and question document coming in. We're pasting questions from the chat to the question document, but if you want to just put your questions into the Google Doc, it makes it a little bit easier. I think we've answered most of these, but one of the trickier ones is, would you want to create a mesh based on the real positive data rather than the combination of simulated zeros and positive measurements?
You could do that. I guess you're going to get, you know, if your goal though is, you know, like the tree data set, I think there's kind of a big hole in the middle, and if we're trying to make fine scale predictions to what's going on there, I guess if we don't have any data, it's you know, you're going to be mostly predicting absences anyway. So I think it probably is going to affect some of the uncertainty in the areas around those. Like if you have I guess like a non-uniform survey, and or like your observations are really patchy in space, it seems like your uncertainty near those patches is going to be probably affected if you just build the mesh based on where the data, where the observations are. Yeah, I need to think about that a bit more.
Yeah, that's a good question. Sean also noted, you know, it depends how you're building the mesh as well. Like if you're using a k-means algorithm, or if you're building it based on sort of minimum cutoff distance. So there's certain meshes that respond more to the density of samples than others. Let's see, more questions. Somebody asked, is there ever reason to include year as a smooth rather than as a factor? As I tried to explain, you know, we typically do include it as a fixed effect because we want to get a prediction for each year, like for an abundance index. But certainly there are lots of situations where you might want to model that differently as, say, a random intercept or something like that.
And we will have an example with a smoother and random walk coming up in the forecasting slides.
And Eric is answering this question in real time, but somebody asked, basically, how do you determine the optimal number of pseudo absences? Is it just trial and error? The answer appears to be yes. Just keep adding them until you see no change in predictive performance.
Yeah.
There's also a question here about whether you need a mesh if you're fitting a non-spatial model, like if you've turned off all the random fields. And technically the answer is no, it has no effect. But in reality, the main branch of the package still requires you to have a mesh in the mesh argument, so you have to feed it something. But we're hoping to fix that soon. There's just some parts of the code that expect there to be a mesh object, that's all.
Yeah, this most. Okay, there's a
Good
really
question.
long question. We might need to just answer that in the document.
Somebody
Oh,
asked a good question about variable coefficient approaches with SDMTMB, and I think that those are basically some of this things we'll be talking about in the time varying stuff.
Yeah, the time varying and the spatial varying.
Yeah.
Plus,
Yep.
and we'll talk in there, you can also just use the GAM versions.
Yep. Yeah. So I think maybe that's the end of the questions on the pseudo absences. So maybe I will kick it back to Sean for the to talk about the time varying models.
Sure. All right. This is the wrong set of slides. These are the right set of slides. So I'm going to talk for a bit about how you can model time varying coefficients with SDMTMB in a variety of ways. After this, Lewis is going to talk about spatially varying coefficients. So why might we want time varying effects? Well, we can have two kinds of time varying effects. So we can have time varying slopes and we can have time varying intercepts. We might want time varying slopes, for example, if we want to allow for evolving responses to some covariate. For example, a species may be changing its depth distribution over time and we're modeling depth in the model. An example of this is a paper that Foligno led, recently published in Fish and Fisheries, and there we were modeling groundfish density with depth, but we didn't want to constrain the fish if they were moving deeper when water was warmer, because that was part of the main hypothesis of the we were testing in the paper. Time varying intercepts could be allowed to allow for variable means across time with some amount of constraint. We were just talking about that in the questions about using factors. So factors allow the year means to be completely independent, but if we had a random walk, which is what we're going to do here in a sec, or a smoother, then it allows it to vary by year, but it constrains it somewhat. And importantly, having some kind of a model for time, so not allowing it to be totally independent, allows us to interpolate or forecast over time, like we'll talk about in the forecasting slides. So time varying intercepts, there's several ways these can be built in SDMTMB or similarly in other modeling platforms. So you can have independent years or time slices, whatever they are, with a factor effect. So they're totally independent. You can have random intercepts. So that would be the like 1 bar year as an example. And there your year effects in this case would be drawn from a normal distribution. You could have a smoother for a year. Or finally, you could have a random walk, which is what we're going to talk about next. And that's sort of the main additional functionality added in SDMTMB over what you could do in other common modeling platforms. So a random walk is simply you have some variable here. Exit t could be an intercept or it could be a slope covariate. And you're just saying that the value in 1 year is equal to the value in the previous year plus some normally distributed noise deviation. And in SDMTMB, it's defined by the time varying argument. And it takes a one-sided formula. So that would be, for example, tilde1 for an intercept, or tilde0 plus depth if you wanted to just have a depth effect vary over time. The 0 there saying to omit the intercept. One very important thing when setting up the time varying argument is that the initial coefficient is unconstrained. So in other words, you don't want to have the same covariate in the main effect formula and in the time varying, because then they would represent the same coefficient in two places. So as an example here at the bottom, this is the similar model of Pacific cod that we talked about last week and in the exercises. And the only addition here is that time varying argument. So we have suppressed the intercept in the main formula. So it's density tilde 0 plus, and then a smoother for depth in this case. And we've just chosen arbitrarily to set the basis function at 5, the k equals 5. But then we've added this argument time varying equals tilde 1. So this tells it that the intercept is now part of the random walk component of the model. So if we fit that model and we print the output, we get output that looks similar to what we've seen before, but there's now a new section for time varying parameters. And I'm just showing you a selection of what comes from that output. But now we have an intercept for each year, and it has an estimate and a standard error associated with it. Time varying parameters are not yet in the tidy function, but we can grab them ourselves out of the TMB SD report element. So here we're just illustrating pulling out the those same values in a matrix. So the other approaches to modeling time varying intercepts that we talked about initially, one would be to have a factor for year. Another would be to have those random intercepts, so they're independent, drawn from a normal distribution, the second one here, or we could have some kind of a smoother for year. And I'm not going to show all the code, but we've just fit all those four now options and illustrating them here that they give you similar but subtly different results. I think probably the easiest thing to pick out is the difference between the as.factor year, the orange one. You can see that that one's totally unconstrained, and at the lowest points and the highest points, so here in 2004, the highest point here, the orange one is the highest, and the lowest point here, the orange one, the factor is lowest because it's completely unconstrained, whereas the other ones are a little more constrained. So subtle differences. This might look different in different situations. The key difference between the 1 bar factor year, so this is the random intercept, versus the time varying one, this should be tilde 1, is just that the deviations are that the year effects are drawn independently from a normal distribution here, whereas in the time varying one, each subsequent deviation through the time steps is drawn from a normal distribution. So there's a time component to the error. So extending this from just a random intercept, here we're going to look at two random slope effects. So in the PCOD dataset that's built into the package, depth scaled is log depth that has been centered by its mean and divided by its standard deviation, I believe. And then this is depth scaled squared. So I'm just putting a quadratic effect of log depth, and I'm suppressing the intercept in the time varying component, but I'm leaving it in the main effects. So we've got one intercept and then an effect of depth and depth squared that's going to vary by year. And if we fit that and then we predict across a sequence of all depths for each year, this is what the output looks like. So you can see here that we've allowed for different shapes of the depth effect through years. So, you know, here back around 2010 or so, they were a little bit on average deeper. Here in the latest data point, which I think is 2017, sorry, they were a little bit deeper, and in 2010 they were a little bit shallower. So they've gone a little bit deeper in the most recent year. So to summarize this, time varying is a formula for coefficients that follow a random walk over time within sdmTMB. You want to make sure that a coefficient isn't in both the formula and the time varying formula. And this includes the intercept. Time varying formula just takes plain simple parameters. It cannot take smoothers because the smoothers themselves are penalized random effects internally. But you could have a polynomial in the time varying component the way that I coded it earlier, or you could code it like this with the I to protect the variable squared. You could instead have a smoother for depth and allow it to be different for each factor year using that MGCV syntax, so independent smooths for depth by year. Or you could have a two-dimensional smooth. Here we've got formula equals smoother for depth and year. So now you've got this two-dimensional interaction between depth and year that is evolving. And that's it for the time varying. Do people have any questions at this point?
Oh, Kyle Wilson is asking, is a random walk the only option for time varying? Could there be a long-term trend as well?
So yeah, right now there's only a random walk. I think probably adding an AR1 option would probably be the next thing we might do. There's no reason why you couldn't have a fixed effect to allow for drift. Like if you had numeric year in the main effects, then you would have a linear effect plus the random walk around that. So you could get creative in that way. But right now, the time varying formula is a random walk.
And Jimmy Anelli asks, in the latter, not sure which is the latter, would that take care of interactions?
I'm not sure what that's referring to here.
Maybe referring to, as opposed to using some other smoother on a non-time varying effect? Is that what you're asking, Jim? Oh, he's asking whether there can be interactions with time varying parameters.
Oh, I mean, you can have interactions that time vary, but there's no way to explicitly have, I guess, covariates of those time varying parameters within the model, if that's what you're asking. That would be neat, though.
Okay, so here's a question that we're kind of going to cover here and in the next set of slides. If you want to have year as a factor in the model, does it have to appear in both the formula and in the time argument?
Sorry, what was the first part of that? If you want to have year
Year
as a
as a
factor,
fixed effect.
you don't necessarily have to have, so you need to have the time argument defined if you want to have spatiotemporal fields, because it needs to know how to structure them. But I could either choose to not have the time defined, or have time defined and just turn spatiotemporal off. And then I have a spatial model. And yes, I could absolutely have as.factor year up here. Then I would just have a spatial field with a mean that's changing by year, which is totally fine. The only reason then that you might want to define the time argument is that the time argument then lets you do other things like calculate the center of gravity or the standardized index through time, because it needs to know the time slices. So if you want to have a spatial random field model only, but use it for index standardization or to calculate center of gravity, you could define the time as year, but the spatiotemporal is off. And then you can do whatever you want with the main effects.
Yeah, and then just to make sure that we are clear in communicating, what you can't do is if you have a time varying factor, you can't also put that in the formula as a fixed effect. So maybe that's what the question was sort of alluding to.
Yeah, I mean, technically you could write it, but it will not be, you won't be able to estimate it.
Another question, can you include an offset for effort like you can with other?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I guess we don't have an example of that in these slides. It's in the documentation for sdmTMB. Right now, the way it's set up is that offset is a reserved word. And so if you put something in that's called plus offset, it'll be treated as an offset, which just means that the coefficient is fixed at 1 for that variable. So you'd expect in this case, offset might be log effort, or yeah.
There's a developing question about environmental predictors and at what spatial scale or maybe temporal scale that you might have them compared to your biological response, how to deal with that. It's kind
That's
of
a
hard
very
to
good
answer
question.
generally.
I mean,
Good
the
question.
hack,
I don't think,
the hack
go ahead.
would be to you know, fit sdmTMB to the covariate data and then interpolate to the locations of your observations and use that as quote unquote data. But I think that that's going to create biases that are undesirable. So we don't have a good way right now to put in data on different spatial scales, but that seems potentially useful.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a number of ways to interpret that. You can do what Eric just said. So you only include the data in the fit for the locations of your observations, but then in the prediction step, you can predict to additional locations given these new covariate information. But there may be occasions where you might want to, outside of the model, just do kind of a more informed interpolation of those environmental covariates before doing that. I guess it depends on how well like a simple general interpolation approach works for the particular environmental variable of interest.
Yeah, I've seen people use just like a bilinear interpolation in that sort of context. Sometimes a GAM, or as Eric said, you could use SDMTMB. If it's reasonably high resolution data, then often just a bilinear interpolation works reasonably well.
One of the follow-ups too is like how do you which I think is good, is like if you were to do something like one of those bilinear or SDMTMB approaches, how do you fully propagate the uncertainty in that? And I think it's a hard question that you know, I think really the kind of like the brute force approach would be to fit the model using any of your favorite flavors of these things, whether it's you know, a GAM or in sdmTMB, we're fitting the environmental data first, and then you know, or ideally do this in a Bayesian framework, and then generate samples from the posterior of your predictions, and basically feed those in as data, but do this large procedure where you're going to be fitting your response data, you know, a large number of times for each of those posterior draws.
And often a not too large number would suffice, like, I don't know, 20 or something, 20 times, depending on the data. Yeah, there's a question from Kyle Wilson about if you had interactions in time varying, say, for example, depth scaled and species, can a main effect be in the model formula? Possibly. I think I'd have to think more about that. You just have to make sure the model's identifiable. For the most part, I think the model will tell you if it's not identifiable because it just won't converge. I mean, if you can put it into the main effects, and that's an identifiable model, then I think you could just put part of it into the time varying effects and that would still be identifiable.
Yeah, maybe getting back to Ian Ellie's question, maybe what he was getting at is, you know, a time varying coefficient as sort of an alternative to a fixed effect interaction of year and depth, say, right? In which case it might be a little bit easier to control have like some nonlinear form of depth and have it vary over time. I guess that's the take home point potentially. Maybe I've oversimplified.
So if we had like a factor year interacting with depth in the main effects, we would end up with something very similar, but the difference is that those curves that I showed with depth would be totally independent from year to year, whereas now they're constrained to some distribution that they evolve.
As a random walk.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Cool. All right, I think we'll move on to the next varying coefficient section. Instead of time varying coefficients, we're going to talk about spatially varying coefficients. So what are we talking about here? What do we mean by spatially varying coefficients? Well, essentially, it's something that describes how the effect of a variable varies over space, right? So, for example, a common thing that we started motivating us to do this, implement this in SDMTMB, was we sort of wanted to get a sense of how the temporal trend and fish density varies among locations at a really fine scale. Another example is, you have some kind of regional oceanographic climatic driver like the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and it affects fish distribution, but it affects it differently in different areas, right? Depending on whether you're closer to the equator or you're at higher latitudes. And simply just the proximity maybe to the kind of area of the driver, the proximal area of the driver where the effect is greatest, right? So in terms of the math, here's the sort of most minimal model you can implement using a spatially varying coefficient, where G is just a inverse link function, and U is a linear predictor. Omega S is the spatial random field, and in this case, it's essentially a random field of intercepts. And then X sub zeta is your design matrix of your covariates. And usually these are things that vary in time, but not in space. And finally, zeta sub S is this estimated spatially varying coefficient. So you can think of that as a random field of slopes in this case. So what situations might you want to estimate this spatial varying coefficient? This might not be the most clear language, but I would say, the way to characterize it most generally is that it's when you suspect that there are sort of non-local effects of some regional forcing, and maybe the magnitude of that effect varies spatially, or even the sign of that effect. So again, kind of bringing in these regional climate indices, one example might be how the influence of the El Nino Southern Oscillation depends on your location, or how the influence of the cold pool, sort of tongue of really cold water along the bottom of the Bering Sea, influences distributions of pollock. Another reason might be when the question of interest requires evaluating local changes or changes at really fine spatial scales. And again, this is sort of what motivated the initial implementation, because we're working with groundfish on the west coast of the US, and in many cases finding basically no kind of broad scale directional shift of large magnitude in their distribution. But the coastline is very complex, and there's subpopulations doing different things, and local drivers affecting the population differently in different areas. And so there may be more nuanced or even opposing patterns across space that could be obscured if you're just looking at sort of a global metric like the center of gravity. Okay, so here's a little bit of code, an example, back to our trusty Pacific cod data that's built in to the package from the Queen Charlotte Sound. And here we're just going to look at that kind of simple case of what the trend over time is at each location. In this case, the trend over time in Pacific cod population density. So same thing you've seen a whole bunch of times now, right? We're just going to scale the year factor, then make our mesh. And in this case, we're going to model density with a smooth on depth, and then year also as a fixed effect, and then year again scaled in this case as a spatially varying coefficient. And I'll mention it again later, but it's quite important to standardize that whatever you're using as your spatially varying coefficient. All the other stuff is the same as you've seen before. We're going to use the Tweety. And in this case, just to keep it simple, we're turning the spatiotemporal field estimation off. So here's kind of the result of that. This is the estimated, essentially random slope field, describing local trends in Pacific cod population density in BC. And it's a little abstract without the coastline map, but essentially what this is saying is that locally, sort of in the center of this domain, population is decreasing the fastest, and it's increasing the fastest maybe up here in the northwest and these various other kind of blue patches throughout the domain. Here's just another example of essentially applying the same concept, looking at trends over time at specific locations for a bunch of West Coast groundfish, and that's published in this paper in ecography that came out last year, I guess. So the idea here was sort of what I alluded to earlier. We're interested in how the interpretation of range shifts might differ depending on the spatial scale you were looking at. And so what I'm showing here is on the left that spatial trend field, like I showed you earlier for cod, in this case for arrowtooth flounder on the West Coast. And then in the second panel, we've done some post hoc clustering of those trend fields just to sort of give you a potential clearer view of what areas have the most similar trends. And then in this third panel over, we have the mean density over all years of arrowtooth flounder. And so I guess what I want you to see here is, their mean density is certainly greatest in the northern area of the domain. But if we go back to the trend field, it's actually telling us that although they're currently highly abundant, mostly in the northern part of this range, sort of at the southern end of their core range, the local trends are actually decreasing over time in that northern section and increasing in kind of central California and maybe even southern part of central California. So it sort of looks like what's really happening is that they're kind of advancing like a traveling wave as their range expands to the south. And that's an interpretation that's really hard to get from something like the center of gravity plotted over on the far right here, which is just so influenced by having these huge densities in the northern portion of the range that, while you can see that there's some slight southward shift, you would still say, okay, well, most of the population is, off of Oregon, and you wouldn't have much indication of range expansion at the edge. So potential uses of this type of implementation using time as your spatially varying coefficient could be things like helping determine how to structure the data going into some assessment model. And I think Ian Taylor actually did use some of these results to help justify how they structured inputs for the LINCOD assessment, I believe. Other applications might include determining how to allocate quota over space, or since this is the protected species workshop, maybe the allocation of sort of allowable take of protected species. A variety of other potential uses I'd be happy to talk more about. And here's a slightly different example, much different system, where we're going to look at a spatially varying effect of a regional climate index, the North Atlantic Oscillation, on snowy owl counts. So the Christmas bird survey has been going on for 50 odd years across North America, and they use citizen scientists to go to these various sites and count birds. And snowy owls are these quite interesting creatures that are eruptive migrants, which is kind of a strange term, but essentially it means that they migrate in response, they migrate for breeding, but the extent of their migration southward in the winter depends on food availability at these various locations. So we had some inclination that this North Atlantic oscillation affects their resource availability, their food, and that may drive the distribution of their counts across space. So in this case, we are going to model the owl counts within intercept, including the North Atlantic oscillation as a fixed effect. And then we're including, in this case, year as a random factor, because we know there's interannual variability and we don't have any other reason to think that it's correlated in time or that it's driven by anything other than the NAO necessarily. And like I mentioned, we're including this index as a spatially varying coefficient. And since we're working with count data in this case, we're going to use a negative binomial to model these counts. And the only other differences from the last COD example is that we are going to estimate spatiotemporal random fields as well, and we're going to assume that they're independent. And here's the main take home. So the size of these circles represents the is scaled to the owl count at all these locations throughout North America. And then the color of the circles shows the effect, the magnitude of the effect of the NAO on the owl count. And essentially what we see is pretty intuitive, which is that there's a greater effect on owl counts closer to the Atlantic coast and further south. So those traveling further south are more affected by NAO indirectly through its effect on the resources for the owls. And just to summarize quickly, so it's a little confusing because we were just talking about time varying coefficients, but for spatially varying coefficients, usually you do want the same coefficient to appear in the main formula and the spatially varying argument. And just recognize that this this field, it represents a random field with a mean of 0. And whatever predictor you're using for that should be standardized to have a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1, and that helps with estimation. And currently, as implemented, we only allow you to have one spatially varying effect, but we're working on a version where you can have as many as you want in a different branch. And if you want more details, there's a whole vignette about this and the paper that I mentioned earlier on West Coast groundfish, and also in this SDMTMB paper that's in review. There's a full appendix that provides more details on this snowy owl example. That's all for spatially varying coefficients. Any questions? This is Max Landmark. Go ahead, Eric. I can't see the full chat. But,
yeah, I'm working on copying some over. One of them is, would spatial varying parameters allow you to model local adaptation, like different temperature responses on the northern and southern end of the range? I think the answer to that is yes, correct?
Yeah, I think that the answer is yes. It's a good question. You know, how do you go about this? Do you not include many covariates and you just look at the trends over space, and then you try to kind of post hoc relate that to potential drivers, or do you include the drivers in the model itself? And that's something that's going to be situation dependent, I think.
Jimmy Nelly says, in the ecography paper, example of error tooth and trends, is there a way to mask out some trend pattern that has a larger spatial standard error in the trend?
Yeah, that's a bit tricky. Sean can probably comment more on this, but usually to estimate the standard errors on every point prediction is just too computationally intensive. So you can't really do that, but we have sort of developed some workarounds for that. Maybe Sean can comment on
Yeah,
that.
there's actually an example in that. So that owl example that Felina worked up, that Lewis just spoke about, that is one of the appendices for the draft paper, and there is a section in there where we do extract the uncertainty on those slopes, the spatially varying slopes, and there we used the sampling from the assumed multivariate normal parameter distribution. So there's a way with predict, there's a thing called, what is it called? I'll have to get back to you on the name of it, but there's a way to check, to select what name of a parameter you are extracting the draws for.
Yeah, and you could probably kind of make your prediction grid more sparse as well to speed things up.
It's called SimsVar right now, or which variable to do the simulations on. So there's a question from Eli about if you may have already covered it, but could you also include interactions like ENSO latitude or ENSO salinity or something like that? Typically, when I've seen the spatially varying coefficients, they are done on a spatially constant covariate. I don't think it has to be that way to be identifiable, but it certainly gets harder to interpret if the covariate is also changing spatially.
Yeah, and it'd be particularly tricky with latitude because we're dealing with space with this Gaussian Markov random field approach. So we don't usually have coordinates as a fixed effect.
Max's question: few predictors and spatially time varying coefficient. I guess like so the question, I think, as I'm reading this, should you fit a model with few predictors and spatially time varying coefficient and evaluate the spatial I guess, like, do you allow the spatial variability in the spatially varying coefficient to suck up the variability, or do you include more spatially varying predictors and evaluate spatial heterogeneity on the predictions? I guess I don't totally understand the question.
I think Lewis was addressing this earlier.
Oh, okay.
I think it's basically there's two ways to get at this. If you're talking about the spatially varying slope, you can either do it post hoc on predictions, like you can literally make your predictions for every time slice and then say run a regression for each grid cell, or you can estimate it internally as a spatially varying slope with time. And yeah, I think we I don't know if we included it, but you did some simulations, Eric, about that,
That's right.
showing how it's, if that is your ultimate goal, is to estimate the slope with time, you're probably better off actually estimating it here as a spatially varying coefficient, because the spatial predictions are being constrained as random effects, and so you end up with some bias in the slopes. But you can get something fairly similar in the end.
Yeah, and I guess the last thing to add to that would be you can always do model selection or comparisons among models where you do include more fixed effect drivers and this spatially varying coefficient of time if you want to kind of more tease out potential drivers. But it is a little bit tricky, right? Because sometimes variation gets just sucked up by the random fields rather than the fixed effects.
Awesome. I don't see any more questions. I propose we take like how about we break till 25 after, and then come back and we'll jump into the last 3 sets of notes. I don't see any other questions in the chat. I do see a question that came up about INLA installs. I guess it's really hard to figure out what's going on without knowing more about the operating system, et cetera. We can certainly help troubleshoot kind of offline. But yeah, I mean, it's very, unfortunately, INLA is pretty sensitive to the compilers that you have installed in your operating system, et cetera. So I think sometimes it requires a little bit of trial and error, and versions of TMB and INLA, of course, have to also be kind of updated in synchrony and talking to each other. So we can help you offline. Okay, well, I think the plan for the next hour, I think we have 3 more other sections that we'd like to talk about, and then we'll take some more broader Q&A like we did last week. The first thing that we'll be covering are some slides that I'm doing, basically on kind of model selection in SDMTMB, and then we will transition and some combination of Sean and myself will talk about doing some forecasting both in time and space, and then last we'll be doing some pretty cool demonstrations with how to include physical barriers like lakes and islands and things like that. Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see. All right. So this is going to be talking about model selection in SDMTMB. And let's make it full screen. Let's see here. Okay. Model selection in SDMTMB. When we think about model selection, I think that there's no right answer for all problems. Obviously, in some cases, we might want to be focusing on metrics that have to do with just our prediction and predictability of the model. And in that case, we might be just concerned with your ability to do in-sample prediction, basically fit the data that you've already collected, to do out-of-sample prediction for future data, either future data in time or data in space beyond the domain that you've surveyed. You might be equally interested in some balance of the kind of your bias and variance. And so this is kind of the classical plot of parsimony that people are familiar with. It's kind of the U-shaped relationship. And I think that I'll mostly be talking about kind of the latter, the parsimony. There's way too many metrics to discuss. A lot of this will be dependent on a situation by situation basis. I talked about the AUC, area under the curve, estimate for binary data from the pseudo absence example. That's certainly one approach for binary data. If you had continuous data, you could use something like root mean squared error that people of course are familiar with. The most common is probably using AIC, which is a really familiar model selection tool in ecology and fisheries. And AIC is just minus twice the log likelihood plus 2 times the number of parameters. And this is really a classic citation, and it's used very extensively. It's really designed for models with just fixed effects, where k is a number of parameters that you can count on your fingers, and it's the number of fixed effects as a discrete integer. So we've written some functions in sdmTMB that are designed to kind of play nice with sdmTMB fitted models and return and basically behave the same way that the same functions work on GLM or GLMMTMB or GAMs on. So in this case, this is just fitting a simple model. The last 2 lines here are the things we care about. You can call log like and pass in a fitted object or AIC, and you'll get the fit, or you'll get the log likelihood, or AIC will return both the log likelihood and that 2k, or that your effective number of parameters that you're including. So another argument that we haven't talked about with sdmTMB that's important when we think about model selection is, just as GLMMTMB and MGCV have this this argument for restricted maximum likelihood, we've done the same thing here. It's important to understand when to turn this on and off, and discussing all of the reasons is beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. There's a lot of great examples in Zuhr's book and more recent citations, but essentially we want to, if we're just interested in comparing models with different fixed effect structures and the same random effects, then we want to use maximum likelihood. So we want to set REML equal to false, which is the default in sdmTMB. If we want to start thinking about comparing different random effect structures, so in this framework, what are different random effects? They're things like, is my spatiotemporal process, is it independent and IID, or is it going to be autoregressive or a random walk? Those are different random effect structures. Or is, does my model even support the inclusion of spatiotemporal effects, or should I stick with a more spatial, just the spatial only model? Those types of questions are also the kinds of questions that are comparing different random effect structures. So in sdmTMB, we have different, we've talked about different fixed and random effects, and there's a lot of different things that include random effects. In addition to what I just talked about with the spatial and spatiotemporal effects or fields, we have the potential to include random effects as these random intercepts. And so using this kind of syntax that's familiar with anybody using LME4 or related software, we can think about these smooth terms that we've used with that we've kind of borrowed from MGCV. All of these smooth terms are internally dealt with as random effects. We have time varying coefficients, which are random walks and also random effects. All of the random fields, as I said, and spatially varying coefficients, which are also themselves a spatial random field. So all of the things on this list constitute random effects. So if we want to compare anything involving these things, we want to do that with REML equals true. So AIC, as I said before, I don't want to hammer on it too much. It's really just designed for these fixed effects models. There's a number of kind of research out there that have illustrated problems with using this for model selection if you're comparing different random effects. There's a great FAQ on this by Ben Volker related to GLMMTMB, so I'd go check that out as well. So that gets us then. So the AIC and that kind of that kind of framework is very much useful for evaluating the model's ability to fit to in-sample data. And it can be viewed as an approximation to cross-validation, but it's not explicit. And so in this case, what I want to talk about are explicitly doing cross-validation with these spatiotemporal models and using cross-validation to evaluate predictive accuracy. And so the first step that we're going to do is split the data into a training and test set. And then the second is going to be, we're going to be coming up with our objective function and think about some different statistics or different ways to quantify predictive accuracy. So one way to think about predictive accuracy is in terms of if we split our data into our training and test set, and we assume that maybe our density is assumed to be a Tweedy response, we can use that Tweedy likelihood to also just calculate the likelihood of our test data. So that would be the first approach. The second approach is something that we're borrowing from largely from the Bayesian literature, which is the expected log pointwise predictive density, or ELPD. And so ELPD is just a second statistic that we can calculate that represents it's a theoretical expectation for a new data set rather than the empirical statistic that's calculated from our predictive density if we were to just use the same likelihood and apply that to the test data. So for anybody interested, this is just the formula for the ELPD. We have our log likelihood for our test data, and we're calculating essentially the log of the average of that. So the citation, there's a couple of really good citations that discuss this, the theory behind this in more detail. So I'd encourage anybody interested to click over and check those out. More importantly, how do we do this in SDMTMB? So, up till now, we've used the SDMTMB function to do all of our model fitting. We've also written a function to do as a wrapper to do the cross-validation. And so the SDMTMB underscore CV is this function that will actually perform this cross-validation. It takes all of the same arguments that SDMTMB takes. We have our formula, the data, the mesh argument. In this case, we're doing logistic regression for this dummy example, so the family, but the rest of these arguments are all new. And so the number of folds, K folds, just represents, I explained one way to split the model might be, or to split our data might be into a test and training set. And in that case, we would just have essentially, two folds where we would have, our one fold would be the training and one would be the test, but we would really only care about the ability to fit the second. In this case, if we wanted to specify the folds randomly, we could specify any number for K folds, and internally, what we do with that is we partition the data set into that many pieces and hold each one out one at a time, fitting the data to the remainder as the training data and treating this as the test. So, so obviously, if you increase the number of folds, it's going to increase the computation time significantly. But this is all written to be done in parallel, so it's computationally actually not too bad. So K folds by default is 8. The fold IDs by default is not included, but if we don't specify the fold IDs, what happens is the data set is just partitioned or sampled randomly, and each observation is assigned to one of these 8 unique folds. Alternatively, what we could do is specify our fold IDs, which kind of outside of this SDMTMB CV function, we could assign each of those data points to a fold that was structured based on the kind of question that we were interested in. As I said, the parallelization is included by default, so this is meant to speed things up. And the second thing we could do to speed things up is by default, each model is fit independently to each set of training data set, to each training set, and then used to predict the test set. By default, what happens is internally, each model is fit independently to each data set. And when we turn the use initial fit equal to true, what happens is the model is fit the first time to basically the first training data set, and each of the subsequent training data sets that's generated, the parameter estimates from that initial model are used as a seed as a starting point for the optimization for the subsequent estimates. So it speeds things up a little bit, but by default it's turned to false. So, but the most important things that you'll want to play with, though, I think, are the numbers of folds and the fold IDs. Okay, so what does this function return? It returns, if we are fitting SDMTMB 8 times, it returns a list of models. according to each of those 8 fits. And so you would want to check to make sure that each of those fits is converging and meeting all of the criteria that we've discussed. It will return a fold log like, which is the sum of the likelihoods for each of the folds, as well as a total log likelihood that represents essentially the sum of the fold log likelihoods. So in the first case here, the fold log likelihood represents if we're fitting or including if we're fitting a model and have 8 folds that we're using, then we have 8 different test data sets, and for each of those test data sets, these represent the total log likelihood over that test data set. And so we're interested in maybe how variable those are, so that's why this is returned. In the second case, if we really just care about the total predictive accuracy of a model, then we care about the total the sum log likelihood across all of those folds, which represents the predicted density for all of our test data. And so those are the first 2 quantities. The second are we can generate the same kinds of quantities for the expected log predictive density across all the data. So the fold ELPD represents the expected predictive density for each of the folds, and then the total is just the ELPD. Okay. So I think by far the biggest question, and this is not something that that we have a lot of examples to discuss, are how to choose the folds for cross-validation. So the questions would be, how many folds do we use, and how do we assign points to folds? Generally, from what we found, based on applications to simulated data and then real real-world applications, the cross-validation is highly variable, and the results can be highly sensitive to the choice of how we partition the data and what kind of sampling scheme we use. And so by default, internally, the SDMTMB CV function is going to be assigning points observations randomly to each of the different folds that you specify. But there's potential biases in doing that. And so one of them is that we might be getting biased estimates of some of our fixed effects parameters, biased effects of some of the spatial covariance parameters, as opposed to if we, explicitly we're trying to account for that spatial autocorrelation by assigning folds based on neighbors in the data. And so there's a great R package and paper that came out in 2019 called Block CV. And so this is on CRAN, but it's an approach that lets you apply several different blocking approaches for sampling, for doing that spatial cross-validation. And so what you can do is, you can call Block CV to generate the folds that we then can pass in as fold IDs to SDMTMB CV. Another question might be how to sample with respect to time. And so I think that that maybe Jim or somebody else brought this up earlier, but we could think about leaving entire years of data out, and there's certainly situations where we might want to do that. I think if we're interested in more, say including fixed effects in a model or fixed year effects, then we can't really leave gaps of years of data out. If we're trying to estimate those fixed year effects, because they're not identifiable if there's no data, you can't estimate the fixed effect. But what we can do is, if we're interested in doing, maybe building a model to have some predictive accuracy over a 1 or 2 year horizon, or maybe look at the robustness to missing data, then we can start thinking about leaving data out, and so in time. And so that gets out to this, leave one. You could do leave one out cross-validation, leaving each year of data out in turn. And so that's looking at the robustness of a model to essentially missing data. Or we could look at just have the cross-validation be forward-looking. And so this is called leave future out cross-validation, typically, where if we have continuous survey data up to 2022, maybe we would start in 2010 and basically use data up to 2010 to predict 2011, data up to 2011 to predict 2012, and so forth. and then look at the predictive ability for the last decade or last 12 years of data. And so that's a exclusively forward-looking approach, which gives us, sorry about this, I'm gonna have to just mute my phone here. Sorry about that. Yeah, again, this is, I'm sorry. Sorry, so how to, yeah, with the leaf feature cross validation. So it's probably really important to think about what specific question you're interested in doing, and then using a cross-validation scheme that's appropriate for that question. So that's something that we can certainly talk about or kick around in the Q&A if people have specific questions for different kinds of problems. But that's going to really have a large impact on the results. Okay, so this is just a cross-validation example, and how to do this with fitting it with parallel. So in this case, we could one way to tackle this is to use the future library. So this is an example of doing this. You just need a couple lines of code, but then we just call the sdmTMB CV function as before. In this case, we've trimmed down the number of folds here to 2 just to make the speed of the fitting faster, but you can play with this example yourself too and increase the folds. But so it's fairly straightforward. And then lastly, we want to talk about kind of ensembling. And so I think the cross-validation is useful for looking at maybe identifying within a set of models, which model gives you the best predictive density or best predictive accuracy for out-of-sample data. But instead, what we might be interested in is finding or looking at the ensemble and looking at kind of essentially taking a group of models and then looking at the predictive ability of that group as a whole rather than any single one. And there's a number of ways to do this. AIC weights have been very common in a lot of the ecological and fisheries literature. We can't really recommend that approach. And instead, what I'll be talking about is an approach called stacking, which is again from the Bayesian literature. And so what we can do is, using kind of the same notation that we have talked about so far, where we use SDMTMB CV or the cross-validation to generate the predictive densities for out-of-sample data. And so in this case, we might have a number of models. We might have let's say we have 5 models, and it doesn't really matter what cross-validation scheme we settle on. This approach is very generalizable, but we can calculate our total predictive density for the test data for each of those models. So the test data here is a star. The training data is Y, and we're just calculating our density for model I with this here. So this could be the likelihood, essentially the likelihood of those of the test data given the model that we fit. So this is something we've run into before. And what we want to choose here are a series of weights, so these W's, that weight each of these total density, each of these model specific densities, so that we can maximize this total density. So the total density on the left is what we want to maximize. We do that by specifying the weights, and so the weights are normalized to sum to 1. And so this is something that is, it's a pretty easy problem once we have our densities on the right. And so the densities are coming as output out of SDMTMB CV, for example. So we've included there's a function on one of the branches that we're working on building into the main branch. But basically, what we can pass in is a list of models, and this model list can be, it can include 2 models, it can include 200 models, or anything in between. And we can include the folds in those or not, or if we don't include the folds, then we can just work with the total densities. But all we do internally is just use the optim function to find that set of weights that best maximizes the combined predictive density and gives you kind of the predictive density for the aggregate. So what those weights are useful for is identifying maybe if you're interested in looking at the relative performance of these models, or looking at within a set of models which are the best. This would be one way to certainly do that as well.
Okay, Eli asks, what's the argument against using AIC weights? Has the stacking been shown to do better?
Because the AIC weights aren't, they're just, they're interpreted as more as probabilities because they are normalized in sum to one, but I think that they've been found to perform not very great.
Particularly when we have these models where the random effects really dominate.
So it's more about AIC more generally than weights, but then when you use the weights to do the weighted model averaging, you're just kind of pounding on potentially a bad choice already, or is there more to it than that?
I think the way AIC weights in these models with random effects often end up with very high weights for one model and basically 0 for the others. I'm not sure if you had more thoughts on that, Eric.
Yeah, no, I think one of the things, I've been working on a few projects with folks using these stacking functions, and it seems one of the promising things about this is that it seems like we don't see the weights for any of the models in the set as going to one. It seems like there's certainly some balance. Certainly some models are not favored, and you can see that, but it doesn't seem like one single model is completely dominating everything. I like Michelle probably got the same comment. Seattle Public Schools masks off. Yes.
Question about model selection. How do you recommend choosing among alternative data distributions, observation models?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Basically, they're saying, should you do model selection on the observation model, essentially, like comparing a compound Tweedy model to a delta model or something like that?
You could certainly do that as long as the likelihoods are, as long as like you're not mixing, yeah. Like, an easy example would be like Poisson or negative binomial, right? So yeah, you can do model selection on the observation error distribution. You can't do something like if you had continuous data you couldn't like round that and compare a continuous distribution to like a Poisson fit to the rounded data because you're not using the same data anymore. I was looking at, oh, go ahead, Sean.
I was just also going to say, I think for the observation model, perhaps a more important component is how well it represents the data. So looking at things like the residuals. Unfortunately, residuals are a little tricky for these models, and there's that vignette looking at all the different kinds of ways you can look at residuals, but probably the simulation-based Dharma residuals would be a good first choice. But I think, yeah, you could use AIC there, but probably the more important thing is how well it represents the dispersion of the data with the mean.
Eli says it feels like estimating the weights from the test data are data dredging.
In the stacking, the weights would be from the test data, not the training data, right?
Yeah, she corrected her comment down below that. I don't totally follow. I think
I can unmute Eric.
Yeah.
So yeah, just by the way, I see I know all the problems with using the AIC weights. I was just wondering if like people had done some recent comparisons. So, but so my first, like when you were describing estimating the weights from the predictive, sort of the performance on the test data, it felt like, well, you know, like when I think about cross-validation and like when I'm estimating the parameters, so I'm estimating the parameters from the training data, and then my performance, I want to compare that against the test data. And now we are trying to come up with an ensemble model, but we are using, I thought as you described it, using the fits to the test data to come up with those weights. So now I'm like, okay, well then how do I test the performance of that ensemble data? Because I just used my test data to estimate the weights.
Yeah, I think I was probably just explaining that poorly and being rattled by phone calls. But I think essentially what I think I was trying to say was, you know, we fit the model to the training data, and then if we use the same likelihood. So like if Tweety was the example, we would evaluate the Tweety likelihood, or use the Tweety likelihood to evaluate that model's, or that training, or yeah, that model's performance for the test data. And so the total likelihood would be the total predictive density for that test data. And so then, so we're not fitting it to the test. We're not fitting the model to the test data. We're just using the test data to evaluate the predictive density. And then we take that total predictive density, and that's what goes into the right side of that that equation for the weights. So it's the weights times the predictive density for out of sample data. So it's not yeah, we're never fitting data to the test. We're never using the test data to fit the model, and then using the weights for that too.
And
But
part of
you're
that's
estimating the weights from the test data.
yeah, so you may want a totally independent test data set that you split off at the very beginning if you want a final measure of predictive accuracy, because the weights are being done through the cross-validation splits. Or the test data there. So you may need two sets of test data, I guess would be the way to put it. Test data to form the weights, and then a totally independent data set that you've split at the beginning if you want to have a final test of predictive ability.
Another question. If you specify an argument for the fold IDs, does the k-folds argument get overridden by the number of unique values found in the fold IDs? Or do those arguments need to be matched?
I think, yes, if you specify the fold IDs, it should override the k-folds. But I'm not 100% sure on the internal
it's
logic.
worth double checking, but yeah, that's how it should behave.
Normally you'd be supplying one or the other, I think. Okay, so there's two kinds of sort of forecasting or extrapolation, interpolation that we're going to talk about here. One is in time and the other is in space. So with time, we might be talking about interpolating over some missed survey year or perhaps projecting distribution into the future. And in space, we might be projecting into some unsampled area or some area just beyond, say, the survey domain. So we're going to start by talking about forecasting in time. And so we need a model for time. So we can't just predict with years as a factor, because if we have years as a factor, as we have in some models, then we wouldn't have any estimate for the missing years. So we need something to constrain the time element of the model. Some options for that would be autoregressive or random walk, random field. Could be a time-varying intercept that constrained as a random walk. Could be a smoother on time. We could ignore time, so we could have no time effect, just a spatial effect. That's a fairly simple one, I suppose. Or some combination of these. So as a first example, with the autoregressive spatiotemporal field, that's what we've done here. And the critical thing for all of this type of modeling involving filling in or projecting time is there's an argument called extra time. And extra time just takes extra, in this case, years, and it pads the data set with that. And they are then available to predict on in the future. And this also has another side benefit, particularly in the case of the AR1 or the random walk random fields, is that this fills in missing years so that the correlation structure is constant through time. So this is a good example with the Pacific Cod dataset that we keep using with SDMTMB. The gaps between the years are not actually quite even, because I think the first 3 years, 2002, 2003, 2004, were 1 year after the other, and then it became a biennial survey. And so if we had just used an AR1 structure without providing any extra time, then we would be assuming that those years are evenly spaced, which in reality probably doesn't make a huge difference, but it could make a difference. So if we just included those missing years, 2006, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, then it's filling in those years so that the autoregressive correlation is always 1 year apart. And here we've done that, but we've also provided some future years, 2018 to 2025. And so at this stage, that's all we have to do. Alternatively, we could have the same model with extra years, but we could specify a random walk on the random fields. Or in this case, I've also supplied a time varying, so a random walk on the intercepts. So the year itself follows a random walk, and then the spatiotemporal field follows an AR1 structure. And as a fourth example here, I've included a smoother on year, which was asked about before. And in this case, an AR1 spatiotemporal set of fields, and again, supplying the extra years. So I've fit those 4 models, and I'm going to show you what happens with the predictions. So I just need to predict on, in this case, I'm going to predict on 1 point in space, but I'm going to predict for every single year and show you the uncertainty on that 1 point in space through time. And so this is what we end up getting out of those 4 models. And the vertical dashed lines here indicate when we actually have survey observations. So you can see that uneven time structure to when the survey was run with an extra year in the second year of the survey. And you can see some subtle differences between what these different model structures imply in terms of what happens, particularly in the forecasting. But first, I'll just point out that if you look at the years between data, so we've now been predicting on years in between where we have data between the dashed lines, you can see that the ribbon here actually grows a little bit because the uncertainty grows when we don't have data. It's more apparent for some than others. And then when we look into the future, the uncertainty starts to grow depending on how we have set up our model structure. So the AR1 fields they're going to revert back to the mean, which in this case was going to be the intercept. So they're going to revert slowly back towards the mean, depending on how, the stronger the correlation coefficient, the slower it's going to revert back towards the mean. These little lines here, these are just draws from that multivariate normal, the joint precision matrix. So these are sort of plausible individual trajectories from the parameter space. So we can see they're somewhat constrained, especially in years where we have data. And then when we start getting into forecasting, they can wander off a bit more, but there's not a very large increase in uncertainty. The random walk fields, on the other hand, are not mean reverting, so they can continue on as a random walk and not come back to the mean. And you see that in the sort of the wider spread of individual draws from parameter space. And so we see that the projected uncertainty on the density at this 1 point in space grows more with the random walk fields. I'll also point out this is a log distributed axis, and that's just because the uncertainty blows up so much by the end in some of these that it would make it very hard to look at these time series because the y-axis would be so giant. In the case in the bottom left here, we've got a random walk on the time element, so the time varying intercept and the AR1 fields. The random walk on time lets the uncertainty blow up a little bit more compared to not having it in the top left. Otherwise relatively similar. And then probably the most different model here is where we have a smoother on year. And you can tell here what's happening is that there's this underlying smoother on the ear effect on top of the AR1 fields. And so when we start projecting into the future, the shape of the smoother continues. So whatever was happening with the basis functions of the smoother at the end continues, and in this case, that implies that the trend is going to continue down, and the uncertainty grows a fair bit because of the uncertainty on that smoother when we're getting away from where we have data. So there's 4 different models here, imply 4 different forecasting predictive distributions. If we dig into what's happening internally in the model, I think it helps a little bit to understand just what I was saying there. So this is for the first order autoregressive AR1 spatiotemporal fields, and they are mean reverting. They evolve towards the mean. So the deviations themselves are going to revert to mean 0 over time. So particularly we can see here after 2017, which is the last year of data, those spatiotemporal deviations slowly revert towards mean 0. And that's what's happening with the mean of the random field. That does not happen with the mean of the field if we had a random walk. So here, the mean of the field basically stays constant at whatever it was in the last year. But in both of these cases, the interesting part of what's happening is the uncertainty on those deviations. So this is the standard error of the spatiotemporal field. So it's just the standard deviation of the joint precision matrix draws. And we can see in the years where we don't have data, so 2006, 2008, 2010, 12, 14, 16, we can see that the uncertainty sort of balloons a little bit compared to the years around it because there's no data to inform it. And then as we get beyond the end of the data set, the uncertainty continues to grow each year. And this is shown here for the autoregressive fields. And if I showed the random walk fields, the same thing, it's just even more accentuated in terms of the projection uncertainty. So in summary, if you want to do interpolation or forecasting with time, you need to use the extra time argument to fill in those missing years. We're hoping to have a more flexible interface for forecasting, so you don't have to include those extra years when you fit, but that you can predict after the fact and choose how many years. Hoping to do that in the near future. You need to have some kind of a model for what's happening with time. And of note, the AR1 field process reverts towards the mean, as I showed. So the deviations revert towards 0, and you'll end up wherever the mean of the fixed effects is. The random walk field processes do not revert towards the mean, and smoothers should be used with caution when forecasting because they're going to extend whatever they were doing where you have data, and smoothers can be confusing if you're forecasting well into the future because of that. So that was time forecasting, and then we'll just talk briefly about spatial forecasting or interpolation or projecting, so predicting into new areas. And for this, we're just going to use that BEI tree dataset that Eric has spoke about a number of times. So these are individual trees observed in X and Y coordinates, UTMs, I assume. And this is the mesh that we've used before. We're refitting the same model we fit before, so we have number of trees is just a factor of an intercept, and there's a spatial random field, even though it's not shown here. It's the default is there's a spatial random field and a truncated negative binomial distribution, and this is over the gridded data set. So this is number of trees observed for a grid cell. It's truncated because we don't have the zeros in this version of the model. And we can predict to a grid over the entire area, as we've done before. We can get uncertainty either using SE fit equals true, which is fast enough here. It gets slow if you have a really, really big data set. Or we could predict on our full data frame and use the NSIM to take draws from the joint precision matrix and then summarize that matrix in terms of the standard deviation as I've done before. So here we've just made a new data frame with a grid over the entire area, and then we've predicted it with SE fit equals true. And this is what that looks like. So of note here, you'll see that the highest uncertainty is actually at the points of the nodes. So at the nodes, the uncertainty is basically informed primarily by this single vertice and its random effect. In between, you have linear interpolation between them. And so the points in between are informed by more than one vertex. And I think because of the way the lines basically connect them, you end up reducing the uncertainty between the nodes. So there's a sort of this known pattern you get with the mesh. And if we project outside of the survey domain, so outside of just this grid, but over the full mesh and even beyond the mesh borders, you can see what happens towards the edge. So as you get to the edge of the mesh itself, you start to get really high uncertainty. And this is why the INLA developers would suggest that you make sure you have a border around your actual data so that your border effects are not affecting the region of interest. And if we project right beyond the edge of our original mesh, then we sort of get gibberish. We get a really low uncertainty. So you want to make sure that your mesh extends beyond the data that you're fitting and that you're going to predict on.
That was great. Great slides on forecasting. Thanks, Sean and Eric. Question sort of about the distinction between prediction and forecasting.
I'm not sure of the exact semantics of the words here. There may be semantics I'm not aware of. This is all coming from the predict function within sdmTMB. I mean, my understanding is typically forecasting would be used if we're talking about future predictions and maybe interpolation if it's between existing predictions, but I'm not sure the answer to that.
Another question from last week. Is the time argument flexible to non-integer values of year? So I guess the question is after you, yeah, if you scale it, right?
That's a good question, and I can't remember how it's currently coded. We've always assumed that it's resolves to an integer. I think it takes them as independent values in the order that they are. So I think it would be okay.
Yeah, because they're recoded, right? So even if the mean, yeah, even if subtracting the mean gives you like year 1.5, 2.5, whatever, I don't think it matters.
But what it wouldn't do is if you gave it a continuous value, like 1, 1.2, and 2, it's going to take those as independent time slices. It's not going to know that 1 and 1.2 are closer than 1.2 and 2. So if you wanted to do something like that, in this case, you could split it up, say, into 0.2 increments and then pad in the extra time if you had an autoregressive structure. And yeah, there's a question here about, the question is more about not understanding forecasting in space. And yeah, I think that's just semantics. I'm not sure we should be calling it forecasting in space. Maybe more extrapolating in space.
So I think one of the last things we want to talk about is how to tweak sdmTMB to allow for more complicated surfaces that include physical barriers like lakes and islands and things like that. So the main motivation for doing this is that if we have a data set, and this is a great example from BACA 2016, that is from, I think, the Finnish archipelago, but we have a fish survey data set that is spatially referenced, georeferenced, but it has a number of different islands that are breaking up the survey. And so we want to be able to account for the spatial correlation between points, but also take into account the fact that there are these breaks in the surface, and that 2 points that are maybe very close together as the crow flies might not be spatially correlated because they might be separated by a landmass. So this is a great graphic that kind of shows this when we these are essentially the what the surfaces might represent, spatial fields might represent for two kinds of models. The first, we have the regular isotropic mesh that we're fitting, and the second is with a barrier. And so I think what I want to highlight is that in the top mesh, you know, this dark brown region that is maybe has high positive values, that ends up being spatially correlated with values that are you know, spatially really close to those points. And so that's kind of the tip down here. But it doesn't take into account that these points might be actually very far apart. If this is like the in-water distance, these points are very far apart. And that distance is not accounted for with this kind of spatial correlation. Contrast that with the second approach, where we are taking into account the weird shape of this surface, and points in the top are not allowed to be spatially correlated with points in the bottom, even though they're, you know, as the crow flies, very close to one another. How do we do this with INLA and sdmTMB? And so you can, it's certainly possible to bypass sdmTMB entirely and do this in INLA. There's a number of good examples in the INLA manuals and books to do this. There's a function that we've talked about called inla.mesh2d. And one of the arguments to that we didn't discuss is you can specify the boundary as a collection of polygons for describing what that barrier looks like. So you can do that in INLA. We're going to talk about doing that in sdmTMB, and the data set that I'm going to be used to kind of walk through how we actually go about this is a data set that the Washington Fish and Wildlife has been collecting for the last 20 years or so. They have extensive trawl survey data on the U.S. side of the border of the Salish Sea, and I picked the Salish Sea because it's, you know, for folks in Washington, it's a body of water that is also very complicated due to inlets and islands and peninsulas. So it's a data set that is you know, collected through time. We're only going to use a single snapshot in 2011, and even though, you know, it collects a number of species, we're going to just be using a single species here and really just focusing on presence absence of Dungeness crab. So the actual response that we're focusing on here is super simple. I'm mostly picking this to illustrate how do we include the complicated barrier that describes the region. So without even thinking about the barrier, this is sort of what the data set represents. We have about a few hundred of these samples from 2011. Presence absence, again, of Dungeness crab, with blue being present and 0 being absent. And so one could take sdmTMB, of course, fit a model to this, but it's not going to take into account the complicated you know, geography of the region. Okay, so the steps for doing this are a little bit complicated, but Sean's put together a really nice example for the I think for the PCOD data set that's included in the documentation. I borrowed from that to put together this example for Puget Sound. So I think it's you know, it's fairly straightforward once you've done it once. There's a couple things to think about. I think the first is it's you know, efficient to kind of bound the range of the data. And so in this case, these values just represent the bounds, essentially the bounding box of the survey domain that I showed previously that shows those points in X and Y, or longitude, latitude, space. Then it's important, sorry, mouse issues. Also important to pick our projections. And so I think these values aren't you know, specific to the actual projection that we're focused on. Here it's UTM zone 10, so that's why we're using these. Again, I'm not going to step through the code here, but this is essentially what we can use this this data to show now. We can pull in these shape files that are polygons that represent the kind of the border of the Salish Sea, and then the black points here represent the actual data. So you can see some of them are down these, this is Hood Canal here, but down some very complicated inlets and points that are very close together in space might be actually separated by large distances in water. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're gonna make the mesh from the survey data, and so just to scale all of these, which were originally in meters, we're going to scale them to kilometers by dividing each by 1,000, and making the mesh using a cutoff distance of 7. That choice of 7 is largely dependent on the number of data points that are going in here, and so because we're only using, I think a few hundred data points, we can't make a finer mesh. So this is essentially what the mesh looks like, which isn't very helpful without actually seeing the geography. But the next step is once we've created our mesh, we can call the add barrier mesh function, which is in sdmTMB. And so the add barrier mesh function takes a couple of arguments. It takes into account the mesh that was created, that was the original mesh that was fit to the survey data or the observations on the previous slide. It takes into account this object PSAW, which it represents the Puget Sound polygons that describe the islands and geography of the region. The range fraction represents within the triangles in the border region or the barrier region, the fraction of the range that these triangles are allowed to have. And so in practice, small values have been found to work pretty well. So 0.1 or 0.2. This proj scaling argument is used for if we've done something to the original data, like in the last slide to make the mesh, we divided by 1,000, but we're actually going to be wanting to convert back to our original units of meters. We need to have this proj scaling argument here so that we multiply by 1,000 to get back to original units. And so this is essentially when we can plot the results of that barrier mesh function. We get we can basically get 2 sets of points. One is the points in water, and one in blue, and one is the points on land in green. And so we've clearly done a pretty good job separating out those observations from the actual land. And then to fit the model with the barrier, we do the exact same thing that we've done before and illustrated previously in all the examples where we pass in our mesh argument, but instead of this being the mesh that's fit to the actual observations, it's the barrier mesh that's been constructed to take into account the original mesh plus the polygons. And so everything else is exactly the same as before. And so what I want to do, and you can actually look at the code on the slides to do this yourself, but I wanted to basically look at the spatial parameters of interest from the model that's both fit without the barrier, and then the model that's fit with the barrier. And so these are the spatial ranges, which again is it's the distance at which the correlation decreases to 0.013. So it's a very small value. And then sigma O represents the spatial variance. So the spatial variance, again, is essentially the magnitude of variability of that spatial random field that's being estimated. And so in the first model, what we see is that the range is much larger. It's 31 compared to a range of 20 when we include that barrier. And then the spatial variance is also, or the standard deviation of the spatial variance is tripled from 3.5 to 10. So so we see some big differences in parameters when we add that barrier. So just to conclude, I think that accounting for this barrier is going to definitely affect our inference about the spatial process. When we didn't include the barrier, we get less complexity in the spatial field. Less complexity just meaning that 2 points in space that are far apart are going to be more correlated when we don't include the barrier. And the magnitude of the spatial variability is also going to be much smaller. Contrast that when we actually include the barrier, we get larger spatial variation and a smaller range. And so so a more complicated spatial surface, kind of as expected when we include that barrier. In general, what we found is that, I think the use of the barriers probably, or whether this is actually a worthwhile endeavor, probably depends a lot on kind of what coastline you're working with. We haven't used this a ton on applications to the west coast of the US because, the coastline is fairly simple relative and doesn't really interact with kind of the survey domain of the data that we're working with. It's in general, best practices would be to, like I said, make the range fraction small, but don't make it much lower than 0.1. Certainly, when we're including the barriers, just as the barriers are affecting the spatial variance parameters, they can also affect, our spatial predictions. As I showed, they can affect the range and the variance. But the take home would be that, if your goal is not necessarily focusing on the spatial parameters of interest or making predictions, but instead, if your goal is to just do something like in stock assessments where we're, generating a standardized index, then using these barriers may not actually change much of the index trend, and the results might be very comparable between the two approaches. So with that, I think I will stop sharing and take any questions.
There is one question. They're wondering whether if the barrier is much larger than the spatial range, does that sort of alleviate the problem of having the barrier, or is it still important to implement the barrier model? So I think what they're getting at is if like you have a huge island and the distance across that island is much greater than the spatial range, you won't be estimating correlation between points on either side of the island. So that won't be the issue. But so generally, I think the answer is sort of yes, but you have to be careful about your mesh construction, right? Because you don't want necessarily to have like a vertex of your mesh on land or in an area that can't be observed. Would that be correct characterization?
Yeah, I'm just looking at the notes, look at the question.
Yeah, I guess it's less of a problem if, like, I guess Vancouver Island would be one example. If you have data on one side of Vancouver Island and the other side, but it's wide enough that correlation estimated from fish on the inside is not going to affect the fish on the outside, then I think that's probably also less of a problem. Yeah. The sort of the hack, like there's many ways that have been developed in the literature on dealing with physical barriers, and this version is proposed as a relatively easy to implement and relatively fast to estimate version that's sort of a hack in that it just makes the spatial correlation decay faster over the barrier as opposed to absolutely stopping it. So I think if your barrier is really big, then yeah, you're probably right, it doesn't have much of an effect. If you are in inlets, do the side of the inlets affect the mesh? It would affect the physical barrier. Yeah.
And if there's vertices on land, I guess, like, just to kind of reiterate what Sean was saying, if there's vertices on land that are on the sides of the inlets, and they are close enough to the actual locations you're trying to predict in water, then yeah, that correlation would still be, could still be enough to affect the mesh.
Question coming into the doc. Still typing.
Oh no, this is good. I mean, maybe it's like, can you have an interaction between a barrier and some larger spatial process? like something, a climate driver. I think like another example would be like, you know, a barrier that changes through time, or like an MPA is put in or removed, for example.
And I think the answer is theoretically yes, but not in practice. Certainly not the way it's coded in sdmTMB right now. It's constant. So you'd either have to, you could split up your data by year, for example, and fit separate spatial models with different barriers for different years if you wanted. You could not worry about it. And I guess that depends on the data, how big of a deal it is. Or you could perhaps have some, if you're able to model, the latent variables in the correlation is for variables that are not in the model. So if you're able to model what's causing that correlation in terms of main effects, then you may have less of an issue remaining with the latent variables. So an example might be, if you include depth in the models we've been looking at with Pacific Cod, then I think the spatial correlation, the spatial random fields get considerably smaller because a lot of that variation that was being sucked up by the random fields is now being accounted for by depth. And so that's able to better account for, say, falling off the really narrow shelf going down the coastline better than the random field might be able to. And so that could, if it wasn't depth, if that was some time varying process as a predictor, you could potentially model that without using a barrier.
Might be it for questions.
Excellent. Well, yeah, I guess we also would put together some slides on including priors or for penalized likelihood estimation. I propose, I mean, just in the interest of time, maybe we don't go through those, but have those linked on the main page, and save the time for any other questions or Q&A that people have. Might be a better use of time.
Yeah, sounds good. So any questions related to material this week or last week or anything? It's open.
Or features that you would like to see.
So Kyle asks, for spatial predictions with barriers, are there issues getting a mesh that predicts into the border area outside the survey domain while still having the barrier, like a coastline?
I think the problems are the same. I think the only difference is if you were to plot it all out, the random field would just decay much faster over the barrier, but you still could predict over the barrier. So I think it's basically the same problems. You want to make sure you have a outer border and that you're never predicting beyond the outer border.
Yeah, I think that's a good way, kind of linking those concepts of having that, the mesh extend beyond the edge of your domain, and then the barrier is just sort of an sometimes internal version of the same thing.
You may also need a slightly finer mesh to be able to properly estimate the barrier in some cases, I would imagine, because you want your triangles to be smaller than your range so that you can actually estimate that decay of correlation. And if the correlation is decaying faster, you may need slightly smaller triangles. But I think this is a very cutting edge open area of research that there's much to discover still.
All right, this is Doug Sigourney. I'm at the Northeast Fishery Science Center. Thanks a lot. This has been really great class. I've been very interested in these techniques. I was just curious. So I work a lot with a marine mammal line transect survey data, fitting these types of models. We generally use sort of GAM-ish approaches. I do a lot of my stuff in using a Bayesian framework. But I've been interested in using these techniques, and one of the sort of problems or challenges we have, and this is why I use the Bayesian approach, is because we're estimating a detection function from that distance data. So that's sort of like your effort offset. You have a certain amount of line transect effort, but then you also have this probability of detection that you're estimating from the distance data. And then within sort of Bayesian framework, you can propagate that uncertainty into your final estimates. I think the INLA Brew is package sort of does this, but I've also heard that that can be kind of a tough package to get, to work with. And this SDM package has basically everything else, all these cool other things you can do that you guys have now built in. So I was just wondering if you have any plans, or if you work with that at all, that sort of kind of joint likelihood of propagating uncertainty through, and kind of in this sort of line transect example, or other examples like that. Thanks.
I would say, yeah, that like line transect approach would be a really cool way to extend this. I've thought about that, and I honestly haven't kept up with the literature. I know that that's evolving very quickly too, and people I mean, I'm sure like your group, and I'm thinking about Dave Miller's work. I've been doing a lot of cutting edge things in distance to make things spatial. So I'd want to double check what kind of functionality are in some of like the distance software, and making sure that it wasn't redundant. But I think if there was a potential application or need for it, I think it'd be certainly fun to include it.
Okay, the next question was, we already sort of talked about, using residual diagnostics to distinguish between what the best observation error distribution might be, but are those types of tools also good for complete model comparison, or is it better to just use cross-validation? Generally, probably better to use cross-validation, I'd say, but they kind of work hand in hand.
Yeah, they work hand in hand, and I was starting to answer that. It partly depends on your goal. If your goal is purely prediction, like it often is, say, in machine learning models, then cross-validation is king, and all that matters is what makes the best predictions. But if part of your goal is inference, so getting uncertainty on parameters, deriving relationships, uncertainty on predictions being reasonably representative, or being able to simulate new data sets that reflect your fitted data set, then the residuals are important because they're telling you something about if the model is properly representing, it's consistent with your data. So if inference is your goal, then you want to make sure all the models that you're comparing in cross-validation are sort of valid representations of the data, and that includes having no patterns in the residuals.
Great. And next question is, I guess I might take this in two parts. Can we use this framework for modeling data from a systematic sampling approach? And then I would say the second part of the question is specific to like fisheries acoustic transit data. So the answer to the first part, yes, you can apply it to data from a systematic sampling design, including transect data. In practice, in some applications, I guess not necessarily in sdmTMB, but in kind of similar models in VAST, there have been specific cases where using bilinear interpolation between the sample locations has introduced some bias in the predictions, so you might want to be careful with that. But I don't know. We haven't figured it out to the extent to give a general piece of guidance on what is causing that specifically. And an example of systematic data, the Bering Sea, Eastern Bering Sea shelf bottom trawl survey is a systematic design, and we've applied these models for index standardization for those data.
Yeah, the only really important thing is that the sampling design is not tracking the underlying response variable. So if your survey is set up so that you go where you think the fish are in a given year, then you're kind of breaking the basic assumption of the whole class of geostatistical models that are being used here. The International Pacific Halibut Commission survey would also be a fixed station survey, and we've used this model on that data set, and the IPHC themselves uses an INLA-based model which is basically the same kind of model we're talking about here on their data. In fact, they even had a year where they extended their fixations to encompass a wider range of covariates, like depth, so that they could better inform their INLA geostatistical model for index standardization. Do you have to tweak the data to make them randomly distributed? No, you can just use the data as they are. Yeah, the only real assumption about the data locations is that they're not chosen dependent on the response variable. You can imagine if you're only looking where you think there are fish, then of course you can have a biased view of what's happening elsewhere in the ocean.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's certainly a key assumption. It seems like there's some interaction of that with your desired scope of inference, right? If you really just want to estimate the abundance in this core area where most of the fish are, and you only use data from that area and predict to that area, that might be okay, right?
Yeah, I think so. If it's conditional on where you have sampled, and you're okay with inference conditional on where you've sampled, then that's fine. Yeah.
But yeah, that's kind of the key lead into the issues with preferential sampling related to using like fishery dependent data, right? Because typically fishers are targeting areas of high abundance or high expected revenue.
Well, when you're reading fisheries acoustics, you don't know where the fish are. You just have a transect, either zigzag or parallel transect. So it sounds like it's randomly, just randomly sampling when you do an acoustic surveys, because you're not like going exactly where the fish are. It's not like when you are just sampling, well, doing troll where the fish are. So I don't know. I mean, it seems like to me, it's systematic, but it's random in some ways. So anyway, just to clarify that.
Yeah, I think it's okay because of that.
Yeah, actually, that one of the cases I mentioned, that I'll see if I can link to something that you can access, but they have been applying these models to that specific type of data, fisheries acoustic transit data in Alaska, I believe for Capeland. I'm not sure if I can point you to a report for that. I'll look around.
That would be great. Thank you. Appreciate it. Because I do have some data that I'm trying to do the same thing. I'm trying to use the package. And it sounds like it would be good to see an example, because that you still have a systematic sampling and you're basically biased by that. Maybe I need some more understanding how to use systematic data to do the species distribution models. It's always been a tricky thing because your statistic may not be accurate.
I just posted a link to a recent paper where they try to deal with preferential sampling when they're combining commercial and survey data. In that specific case, they found it didn't make much of a difference in the end. But
Sean, is it in the chat or you put it?
it's in the Google Doc. But that's for preferential sampling. So that's for dealing with the commercial data. I don't think you have that problem here.
Any other questions? We got maybe 10 more minutes or, oh, here we go. So going back to the example, spatially varying coefficients for Pacific cod on the scaled time. If we wanted to forecast extra or missing years with that, would we then need to add those years in extra time by adding years on the scale of the scaled years vector?
I think I can answer that.
Okay.
So in that case, with that example that Lewis had, the spatial varying scaled years internally is sort of independent from the time column. Time column defines the slices of time for the discrete time units for the random field, and then the scaled years is just for the spatially varying predictor. So You could. Haven't actually tried this, but I don't see why you couldn't. You would have the extra time argument could have your extra years that you want. And then it's just important that when you predict that you have to provide predictor data for those missing years. So in that case, your prediction data set would have the missing scaled year value.
Right. So you don't need to include the missing years in the input data when
Yeah.
you scale it. I guess
Yeah, it's
that's
a
the
latent
question.
variable. It's just in there as a random effect, but there's no data to inform it. So you wouldn't modify your fitting data. But you just need to make sure that whatever covariates are in the data, that there's data for every year of extra time in your prediction. One thing I think we never actually talked about or showed, but it's in the paper, is a speed comparison between INLA, MGCV, and sdmTMB or VAST. You can see that in the draft paper, but the gist of it is that for medium size and below mesh complexities, like number of knots, then the TMB-based models are faster than INLA. So at like up until, I forget what it is, maybe like 500 knots or something, 500 vertices. When you start getting to really high resolution meshes, then the INLA starts being faster. INLA scales better to really high resolution meshes than Template Model Builder does. And they're all a bit faster than MGCV for the same kinds of models.
Yeah, maybe another kind of addendum, since we didn't have time for the priors bit. Maybe we should just give a little more context about why we enabled priors. I think most generally it's to just improve estimation in some of these more complex models by constraining the parameter range.
Yeah, so priors can go on, I think, everything or almost all the parameters, and it could be an informative prior on a main effect coefficient from some other analysis or knowledge. It could be a prior, say a prior with a mean 0 and standard deviation of 1 or something small to sort of constrain the value and provide a robust regression, like something like ridge regression. But one of the main uses is the priors that are available, the penalized complexity priors that are available for the range and standard deviation, spatial standard deviation parameters, and that can help constrain the model and help with convergence. It's the same prior. The penalized complexity priors are the ones that are used by default on the random fields within INLA. So in INLA, you always have to have, as far as I'm aware, a penalized complexity prior on the random fields. By default, in these template model builder versions, we don't have any priors, but one of the things you can do is turn on those same priors in TMB to match INLA.
One question here. How would you use a previous model fit to speed up fitting a slightly tweaked model?
I used to have an argument for that. I might have.
We have the extra optimization stuff, but that's a little bit different. That's more
Oh
like
yes, I did.
if you had a.
So
Sorry, go
previous
ahead.
fit. I haven't actually used that in quite a while, but so I forget to what extent it's in the unit tests. But there is a previous fit argument, but it has to be set up exactly. Oh, it does work because we use it elsewhere, but it has to be set up exactly the same way. So in practice, that may not be so useful. It's used within the cross-validation function because you can tweak the weights. So if you want to fit the model once, tweak the weights, refit it, starting from the same position. Within the control argument, you can provide a list, and in there you can change the initial values. So you could grab the parameters from a previous fit and then start it again at the same values. There isn't really a simple interface for that right now beyond that previous fit.
And to clarify, like that latter example is more useful if like you fit a model and then you decide to add a covariate to it to make your model slightly more complicated. You might want to, and that new covariate scaled, maybe it's reasonable to start your new model about where the old model had converged, and then you can extract you have to go into the SD report probably, or extract the parameters in a more complicated way, and then pass them in as the start argument to the sdmTMB control.
Yeah, they're available from Tidy, or they're available in the, I think it's $model, $par. And then within the control list, there's SDMTMB control, and within there's a start list. So it's just a named list of all the parameter starting values. There's also a map list that we haven't talked about, and that lets you fix it. This is kind of TMB speak, but if you have an NA factor value for the map, then it fixes the parameter at that. So if you provide a starting value and you map it, then it's fixed at that value. But we're getting really into the weeds here.
Yeah, slightly related piece there I was going to mention was the if you run a model and you're not happy with the convergence or the gradient's a little bit high, we have a run extra optimization function to improve that without having to start from scratch again.
So that optionally it either restarts the NLM INB optimizer at the previously fitted values, or it uses a Newton optimizer, or both. That approach is also taken in VAST, which is where we borrowed the idea from. So that won't help if the model has not, if there's NAs for standard errors, that's not going to help. But if you have a model that is just has a gradient that's a little bit bigger than you want, you can sort of crunch that gradient down by restarting the optimizer. So let's run extra optimization.
Yeah, similarly with if the Hessian isn't positive definite, then it's not going to help either, probably.